Money did not create debt. Debt created money. Long before coins were struck, before metal carried the authority of kings, societies had already learned how to bind the future to the present. People could lose their land, their labor, even their freedom, without a single coin ever changing hands. The power did not lie in metal, it lay in record. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. In the great temple cities of early Mesopotamia, obligation did not disappear when a season ended. Once pressed into clay, it endured. A tablet stored in an archive could be retrieved years later. It preserved more than memory. It preserved claim. When allocation was first recorded, scribes tracked deliveries of grain, livestock assignments, and labor contributions. But recording did something more than organize distribution. It allowed obligations to survive beyond the moment of exchange. And when an obligation survives, it can be enforced. This is where debt begins, not in barter, but in administration. By the 3rd millennium BCE, temple and palace institutions across Sumer managed extensive agricultural estates. They oversaw irrigation systems, coordinated seasonal labor, and maintained large granaries. Barley was measured in standardized units. Silver was measured by weight, not as coin, but as a unit of account. Livestock were counted and categorized with precision. Measurement created comparability. Comparability allowed deferral. Agriculture was seasonal, yet consumption was continuous. A poor harvest, a damaged canal, or illness within a household could create immediate scarcity. In such moments, cultivators sought grain from temple storehouses before the next planting cycle. The advance was not informal. It was inscribed. The amount received was recorded. The date of repayment was specified, usually after harvest. Often an additional portion was required upon return. Old Babylonian sources indicate a commonly recognized rate on silver loans of 1/60th per month, approximately 20% annually. Grain loans could carry higher rates. On its surface, this appears modest, but the arithmetic carried structural force. Agricultural production followed biological limits. A field could only yield what rainfall, labor, and soil allowed. Its increase was linear and uncertain. Debt, however, was calculated mathematically. Even when interest was structured annually rather than compounded monthly, successive years of shortfall expanded the balance owed. Over time, obligation could grow faster than recovery. The additional portion acknowledged time and risk, but it also introduced mathematical pressure into the system. Calculation alone does not produce hierarchy. Enforcement does. When repayment failed, the record activated authority. Tablets were stored in designated archive rooms within temple and palace complexes. Many contracts were enclosed within clay envelopes impressed with cylinder seals. The outer casing bore the same text as the inner tablet. If tampering occurred, the discrepancy would be visible. Seal impressions identified responsible parties. The official version of the agreement resided within the institution. Its stability gave it force. This structure also produced informational asymmetry. Literacy in cuneiform was limited to trained scribes. Most cultivators could not read the tablets that governed their obligations. The scribe mediated between spoken agreement and written permanence. The archive was physically and intellectually controlled space. When disputes arose, the tablet could be retrieved and read aloud. Its authority rested not only on its content, but on its institutional custody. The record did not merely preserve the past, it defined the enforceable present. Fields pledged against a loan could transfer usage rights. Livestock could be claimed. In documented cases from Mesopotamia, individuals unable to meet obligations entered debt servitude, sometimes along with members of their household. Legal collections, such as the Code of Hammurabi, outline regulations governing these arrangements, including limits on certain forms of debt bondage. The existence of such rules demonstrates that debt was central enough to require formal boundaries. The decisive transformation lies in durability. Once inscribed, obligation could persist across years. Tablets stored in archives preserved claims beyond the harvest that created them. In some cases, repeated cycles of borrowing bound households to institutions over extended periods. Debt formalized long-term claims within early institutional economies. Hierarchy deepened through continuity. A cultivator recorded as a debtor was not only a landholder, he was an entry within a system of claims. Access to seed grain, livestock, or future advances could depend on recorded balance. Status became shaped not only by land or lineage, but by liability preserved in clay. Yet debt was not purely extractive, it enabled coordination. Advances allowed cultivation to continue after environmental disruption. Artisans could receive materials before completing specialized work. Administrative centers could plan irrigation maintenance and construction projects because obligations were measurable and enforceable. Debt linked present need to future production. It created temporal structure. At the same time, accumulation carried systemic risk. If too many cultivators lost land or entered prolonged servitude, agricultural productivity would decline. Institutional power depended on stable production. For this reason, Mesopotamian rulers periodically issued debt remissions, known in Akkadian as andurarum. These proclamations annulled certain personal debts and restored land or status to affected households. The logic extended beyond relief. A heavily indebted peasantry could weaken the state's capacity for labor mobilization and military service. If institutional creditors absorbed too much land and manpower, royal authority itself could diminish. Debt remission functioned as a structural recalibration, ensuring that surplus, labor, and allegiance ultimately remained under sovereign control. The existence of such resets reveals an essential truth. Debt was powerful enough to destabilize the very system that relied upon it. Across other early civilizations, similar dynamics appear. In ancient Egypt, grain advances and labor obligations were documented in administrative records. Workers received rations tied to service. Disputes over withheld provisions survive in writing, indicating that obligation was formalized and enforceable. Wherever storage capacity, measurement, and centralized authority converged, deferred obligation emerged. Coins were not necessary for this architecture to function. The essential monetary roles of unit of account and store of claim already operated through weight standards and institutional archives. What coinage would later provide was standardized portability and broader circulation between strangers. But the underlying structure, calculation, deferral, enforcement, was already established. Debt organized time before money organized exchange. It transformed seasonal vulnerability into durable obligation. It converted surplus into leverage. It embedded hierarchy not in conquest, but in preserved record. Long before metal bore the stamp of rulers, clay tablets carried enforceable claims. The future could be pledged, the harvest could be anticipated, labor could be bound. The architecture of monetary power began when obligation was written down. The very language of finance was shaped within this system. In Sumerian, the term mash referred both to interest and to a young goat. In Akkadian, sibtum carried meanings associated with increase or addition. The terminology reflected observation rather than metaphor. Interest was understood as something that grew from an original principle, just as offspring grew from livestock. Debt generated increase through calculation. The vocabulary itself embedded growth into obligation. Through language, economic expansion became normalized as a feature of record. By naming the increment, scribes stabilized expectation. Interest was not accidental, it was defined, measured, and anticipated. In doing so, early institutions transformed arithmetic into structured policy. The ledger did not merely record value, it organized how value multiplied. In the next episode, we will examine how temple-centered economies organized redistribution and authority at scale. And we will understand how surplus, once centralized, became the quiet engine of power.